Hi guys, so just going to do a short video going through some of the most frequently asked questions that I see on my YouTube comments, Discord, Twitter, just general VR community about the Universal Unreal Engine Injector. So skip ahead to any time stamps of something in particular you want answered, but I'm just going to run through some of the basic questions I get. So what is it? Well, essentially, very quickly, it's a utility that enables flat screen Unreal Engine executables to become VR experiences. Essentially, the viewport or camera in those will now be your head, so you can look around 6DoF kind of like any other VR game that you've played. And I'm going to use games as the main example here, but this can be extended to educational experiences, architectural visualization, training, but for this audience we're just going to really talk about games. So this next one I get a lot for some reason. Is it real? It seems to be trendy nowadays to think everything's a conspiracy, but no, it is real. It's a real application, and it's currently in development. And it is a thing. So yeah, I'm going to go into some more detail now on different aspects. So I've seen this question quite a lot, and even from myself when I first saw this, but does it work on every Unreal Engine game or some other game, game name? So at the moment this is working on Unreal Engine 4 and 5, and we do have to caveat that with the fact that the VR rendering pipeline that was kind of introduced into Unreal Engine occurred in the early versions of Unreal Engine 4. Now, the earliest kind of executable that I found or game that I've tested was Fortified, which was on 4.9. I did also play Abzu, which was released slightly earlier in February of 2016, and that's actually currently on 4.12. So generally, as a rule of thumb, if it's an Unreal Engine game executable and it's kind of after 2016, there's a high chance it's going to be one of the later versions. Most games that you play are probably the later versions, like 4.27. Now, Unreal Engine 5 does work. There's a few games like The Bus, Demonologist, a few kind of demo projects and things that we've tested. But that's kind of an ongoing situation, so Praydog's working to support new engines as they come. But currently, Unreal Engine 4 to Unreal Engine 5. Sadly, Unreal Engine 3 games don't work. I know there's a great library of games out there. And generally, they're going to be older titles, but there are some exceptions. So, for example, Mortal Kombat 11 recently came out, looks great. XCOM as well on the PC looks great as well, but these are actually heavily modified Unreal Engine 3 games, so they won't work. There's lots of games that potentially you might not know if they're Unreal or not, especially if you haven't played them or they're upcoming. Generally what you can do is check the kind of game files, but if you don't have that, just Google, see if there's the logo at the start. What I've been doing is using Steam database to kind of see that there's a app info and detected technologies. That's a good source of finding out if a game is Unreal or not. But there are thousands, literally thousands of Unreal Engine games, and that's not even counting like all the other things like architectural, training, learning, educational executables that are using Unreal Engine, film stuff. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and we've only tested a few hundred, so it's there's still lots of unknowns. So the next question, what are the rendering methods used? So there's some confusion as to this, because when people think of VR modding tools, I know I won't name other modding tools, but there are multiple ways in which to achieve a for a game to appear in a VR headset. This is very much native and kind of what you'd expect from a normal game. So the primary method of rendering is native stereo, which any native VR game would use. When it works, it would look the best, perform the best usually, and that's the majority of games we tested. Now, sometimes it can cause some crashes or graphical bugs in the game that doesn't kind of work well with it. And you can switch to some other rendering methods, which I'll explain in a second. But in native stereo, temporal effects like temporal anti-aliasing are intact. DLSS, AMD FSR 2.0 usually work and completely fine. There's no ghosting, like you'd expect with just any normal VR game that you'd buy from a store. So each eye fully synchronized, and is the actual stereo rendering pipeline in the Unreal Engine to achieve that image. So the next rendering method is called synchronized sequential. Now it's a form of alternated frame rendering. It does fix a lot of bugs that potentially can be found with native stereo, where something maybe renders only in one eye, or there's a particular effect that doesn't play well with native stereo. Now what this does is it renders 2 frames sequentially in a synchronized fashion on the same engine tick. So the game world doesn't advance any time between the frames that are generated. Looks normal, but some temporal effects like temporal anti-aliasing do have a ghosting or doubling effect. If you see any of the testing videos on my channel, I generally go and turn that kind of effect off, and that normally removes it. Motion blur is also kind of something you need to turn off as well, and that's kind of the first thing that you should do if native stereo doesn't work in a game. But thankfully, most of the time it does work, and occasionally you might come across some effect that only works in one eye, but most of the time it's normally quite minor.
May I give you some advice? I'm kind of busy right now. Try to avoid the robot's more powerful attacks.
The last method is just alternated frame rendering, which you may see on some other kind of VR modding tools. That's rendering each eye on separate frames in an alternating fashion, but the game world advances time between the frames, so that it can cause some eye desyncs and some nausea. It's not kind of synchronized. Generally not used if you can use the other two, and I've only really found one kind of experience that I've tested that needed it. The vast majority of cases, which if you look at the spreadsheet that I've been collating of our test results in the description, most of them are native stereo that we've tested.
Good evening, sir. Follow me. I will escort you downstairs.
So the next question I see are, what headsets does it support? Like, will it work on my headset? So the team have pretty much every headset I think I've ever heard of. Now the framework menu, the Injector, it supports both OpenVR and OpenXR. So if your headset supports one of those rendering runtimes, then you're fine. But we've tested Quest 2, Quest Pro, Oculus CV1, we've got Pimaxes, we've got Vives, we've got Indexes, and even someone's tested the new Big Screen Beyond, and it's all working well. So no need to kind of fret on that approach. Now, in terms of like controllers, the majority of some of the features are kind of normally tested around Oculus controllers and that general default layout. And Index has like kind of the OpenVR control scheme as well. The majority of games, however, I've actually tested, I'm just using what you would normally use, so a gamepad, Xbox, PlayStation controller, or a keyboard or mouse. And it's only really in the instances where we turn on some motion controls, which I'll talk about later, that I tend to revert to my touch controllers with my Quest 2. So the next question, which is a bit of a meme on the Discord right now, and a controversial topic there, but what about the D-pad? So VR controllers typically don't have D-pads. Now, generally this is solved by just using an actual gamepad that does have a D-pad to play the games. But recently there's been an addition where the capacitive thumb rests can be, you have your finger resting on it, and that acts as a modifier key in which you can use one of the joysticks to emulate a D-pad. So glad to clear that up. So next question, what kind of customization does the framework or the injector allow out of the box? So there's quite a lot here, and I'll probably go into more depth when I do a kind of deeper tutorial how to guide closer to the release. But you can customize a lot, more than you see in typical native VR games, honestly. So other than the rendering methods I mentioned before, you can change the world scale very easily. I know you can do that in kind of Steam VR and some other VR modding tools, but it's a nice easy slider for you to use that. So you can make a game world tiny, miniature, or larger than life. You can also very easily move the default camera and place it somewhere else. So maybe you want to be further away from the character, closer to the character, above the character, to the left, to the right, anything you'd like. And you can switch between different kind of save presets. So I sometimes like a far away view or then a closer view. Other things that you can customize are there's engine variables that can be turned on and off to disable things like depth of field, motion blur. You can cull some of the lights that might be causing problems. You can adjust things like the gamma, the color correction that's just within the engine without having to use a program on top that might add some kind of performance cost. Other things you can change kind of the bindings and the mappings you use on the controller, and there's quite a lot of extra bells and whistles that I'm sure we'll talk about closer to release. So the next one, can I use other mods with this? So yes, a lot of the time, especially in my tests, I'm just kind of testing the game from no experience whatsoever. So I get to the main menu on the first boot up and I inject the VR in and just start playing. But some games can be enhanced with some other mods. So for example, recently I've tested Remnant from the Ashes, which is a third-person game, but there's a first-person mod, and that helps tie the camera to a head of a character. You can do that in something like Jedi Fallen Order. There's a video that the Flat Tip of VR Twitter released earlier, which has that, and Hogwarts Legacy is something similar. So yes, you can use other mods, and a lot of the time that might be a kind of roadmap to fix some of the problems with specific games down the line, where other mods can help enhance a VR experience. So next question I get, referring to the spreadsheet that I made, kind of collating all the testing progress over the last kind of few months. And I've kind of marked a playability scale from works perfectly, works well, works okay, works poorly, and not working, and kind of what does each one of those mean. Now I do have a tab that kind of explains each one of them, but I'll just kind of go through it again here. So not working means it just doesn't inject, so that might be it has anti-cheat, it might not be an Unreal Engine game, or it's too old, something like that. So it doesn't even load in the headset. Works poorly would be that it does inject, so you do get the game in your headset, but it has so many issues that it would be difficult or uncomfortable really to play, so it's not really kind of viable in that instance. So an example I'd use, there's a game called The Gunk, and annoyingly it's very perfect in every aspect, but the main point of the game is to kind of interact with this black goo substance, and unfortunately you just can't see it. It's kind of invisible, and it's like a kind of broken shader effect, and you can't see it. So that's quite a fundamental issue to the game called The Gunk, where you can't see it. So I'd say that kind of works poorly. The fact that it's basically impossible to kind of progress in the game if you can't see that. But other things will be that the either performance is like so bad or has memory leak, or the UI is, or some kind of game mechanic that's so crucial to playing it that you just wouldn't want to play it. Now, okay, works okay. The next kind of level up is that this is kind of some issues, but it's still fun. So I've labeled a lot of the Arc System Work fighters as works okay, because you just can't see the UI, like the health bars and things of that nature. But actually, if it's not that fundamental to having a fun experience, you still can fight, you can still kind of play the game. So even though that's quite a major issue, like not being able to see the health bar, it doesn't really affect that game genre too well, so you can still have a fun time. Now, it works well is pretty much, yeah, you're gonna have a great experience. Just there might be a few little things that really just won't bother you at all. So there might be like one level with a lake in one part that has a reflection effect that's only in one eye, for example, or there's some UI element that's not perfect, or you have to, there's some friction that shouldn't be there, or you do have to do some extra step to make it playable. But that's pretty much, you're gonna have a good experience, and works perfectly is you're just gonna inject, play it, and have a good time, and you don't really have to worry about anything being off or kind of weird. So another question I get are kind of, what are the typical issues? Surely this doesn't look as good as the videos, right? And yeah, I mean, when we're recording, I mean, especially on my channel, I'm recording 1440p 60 frames a second, so any dip or kind of performance issue that goes from like 90 to 85, you're not really going to see it in the video. Or there's like a UI element that's really on the corner of my eye that you can't see in the video but it exists in the headset. Other things, yeah, there's some things that will only appear in one eye if using native stereo. Typically, actually, they're mostly very minor, and can be fixed by just switching to synchronized sequential. But yeah, so there is kind of those things to expect, that there might be some odd elements, but generally once I'm playing and I'm in VR, a lot of those things you do forget about, especially if like the UI is not perfect, or there's a rock over there in the far distance that's got a shadow that's doing something weird. But that's typically what I would say an issue that I would normally come across. Typically, kind of when we inject as well, if the game already has Oculus or VR plugins, you need to kind of pass a no HMD command in Steam, or you can kind of rename the plugins in the existing folder, and the Injector has a nice little pop-up to show you that. But typically there's not that much friction really when using the Injector. Okay, so the next thing is, what kind of PC do I need to run this? So I see this a lot in just kind of mainstream gaming media, that there's a perception that you need a NASA supercomputer to run VR. Does very much depend on the Unreal Engine game or experience that you're trying to run. Obviously, if you're going to try and run a brand new AAA game that's really pushing bleeding graphics, then you're going to need a beefy rig, but there's plenty of smaller experiences as well. Now, I would say as a general rule of thumb, probably a 3080 or better is like, I would probably personally recommend for a really good experience. But one of the testers, Jay, who I'll link down below, he has a 3060 laptop, which is typically much weaker than a typical 3060. But if you're happy to do some extra optimization, lower some in-game settings, lower kind of the resolution to your headset, consider using Space Warp, and especially actually in Virtual Desktop, that application is a really good implementation of it, and that can lower the upper limit of frame rates you need to actually hit. And there's also things like the OpenXR performance toolkit to add things like foveated rendering. So with a 3060 laptop, he was able to play a lot of very, I would say, demanding games like Returnal and Atomic Heart very smoothly, and things like Grounded. So yeah, personally I would probably recommend a 3080 or above for what's currently kind of available to get like a really good experience. But it's unfortunately I do have a 4090, which might mar some people's perceptions that that's what's required, but it just helps that me also record the gameplay and test to have a bit of headroom there. But yeah, a lot of the testers will have a range of different hardware, but yeah, 3060 laptop, kind of 20 series is pushing it a little bit, so you'll really have to run in potato mode. But 30 series onwards is good, and games that do have DLSS or AMD FSR 2.0 really do benefit. So it's great when those upscaling technologies are present or modded in. Apologies if I don't know too much about AMD cards. So another question I get a lot is, are there motion controls? So up until recently, the answer was basically no, and would have had to be added per game by a modder to add something like 6 DoF motion controls. And if you can imagine some of the really great flat to VR mods that have come out recently, like Half-Life 2, you've got Raft, Valheim, Risk of Rain 2. These have really great motion controls, and you can kind of turn around your hand and look at the gun, like say in Pavlov or a modern day VR shooter like Contractors. You can turn the gun towards yourself without moving your head and look around. Recent update, we've now got freed off motion controls. So I've just done some kind of showcase videos before where I film myself to kind of better illustrate what moving your hand does or doesn't do. So if you move your hand left or right laterally or up to your head, it doesn't kind of move the character's arm, but if you can waggle it around in a circle, and it will point where you're pointing, and it does help immersion a lot, even though it's kind of semi native experience for motion controls. Also, if you like, there's a head-locked aiming which you could use in combination with like a gamepad to make aiming a bit easier. It's a bit difficult to show on recording because the head-locked aiming pretty much just looks like a flat screen game. And there's a new option where you can use motion controls and the head aiming to kind of suggest the movement, kind of like you'd see in a normal native VR game. And recently there's a two-handed freed off motion controller, so we'll see where that goes. But that's kind of what to expect. It's not that this VR game mechanic that you've seen in lots of native VR games will be there with injection out of the box day one. So that's just to get your expectations in the right place. So I get this question a lot. So how is this different from other not to be named VR modding tools? So one of the great things I found while testing it is typically some other VR modding tools, the entire mod will break if the game's updated. That's not really the case here, because you're just kind of turning on an engine level. Now, yes, there are some games that have broken, but normally when they've added things like anti-cheat, so for example Marauders recently added that, rendering it not able to inject. I'll talk about anti-cheat in a second. But because you're turning on VR at like the engine level, the performance cost isn't as great typically, and you've got a full VR head movement as you'd expect. So I know there's some great tools out there that will add stereoscopic imaging and then kind of present that in the headset. It's kind of stretched over, but it's not like that. This is how you'd imagine your favorite game if the developers made it for VR essentially, and just kind of very quickly ported it over. So going on to multiplayer and anti-cheat in general. So generally, if a game's got easy anti-cheat or another anti-cheat solution, the game just won't appear as in the drop-down in the program as kind of an injectable game. Now you can get around that if the game offers, like for example, you can start some games and it offers you to play without anti-cheat and offline. And normally those games will then appear to be injected. There are a number of multiplayer games without easy anti-cheat. On my channel you can see me playing multiplayer matches of Guilty Gear Strive, Mordhau, co-op games as well. Typically they don't have that as well. And some of the really big multiplayer games might have private servers, so there's been some gameplay shared of Fortnite and Dead by Daylight, Squad, things like that work that way. But generally, if a game's online, just be aware that it's most likely a modern day title, especially like the free-to-play ones, they'll probably have anti-cheat and it won't work. So a lot of those that I haven't really added to the spreadsheet. If you check that, it's just because those are we know that they're not going to work because they've got easy anti-cheat. Things like Chivalry 2 or yeah, and any of the big like Fortnite, things like that, the actual online modes, those won't work. Okay, so the next question, is this just Steam games or can I use some other game store? Now, yeah, apologies, a lot of the things I've tested have been from Steam, but we have tested games from other locations as well. Now, if you're a 64-bit shipped executable from an Unreal Engine project, then it should work. So basically anything that's running it doesn't really matter where you buy it from. So we've tested some games from Game Pass PC. There's lots of great titles on there like Back 4 Blood, High on Life, Hi-Fi Rush, all working great. Epic Game Store, there's a number of the free titles actually that are supported, and they work just fine. Indie projects like on itch.io, or just if you have the project, even if you just packaged it yourself and you are unsure of adding VR support, this is a quick and good way of checking a flat screen game just to see what it's like in VR. I know we've tested a number of demos of games prior to release or on release, and caught some of the developers by surprise, and they're interested to see their game in VR. So this could be a quite useful tool to see how well it could play in VR. Okay, so probably the most question I see is, when is it released? It always is upcoming. I want this now. Pretty much see that every day. So the Flat to VR Twitter account and kind of the official statement is there's no release date at the moment, and sometime this year is what's been said. Now, this is pretty remarkable project, and if you look at my spreadsheet and kind of see the timeline of more intense testing that's gone on, that's only really occurred over the last few months, and for something so massive, where even if when something gets updated, we don't really know if it's broken something else or another game, or on a certain Unreal Engine build version. So it's a very complicated program, and there's a lot of detail to it. But Praydog and the other people testing and the guys contributing and supporting, working on a lot of cool stuff. So it's definitely going to be worth it when released. Okay, next question is, how much is it? So it'll be free and open source, so you don't need to worry about a pay gate or anything like that. Now, it is open source, so the code will be made available when it's released on GitHub. Now, it is free, but of course you can donate to Praydog through his Patreon. It's just a donation page. If you become a patron there, you're not going to receive the Injector or anything. But it's a good way to show your support, and because he's working very long hours and all the stuff he's been working on is great. And even not just this project, but his work on the RE framework, the Resident Evil games, Monster Hunter, Devil May Cry. Yeah, it's amazing. So it's well worth checking out, and there's a link below. Okay, so next one I get is where can I get more information on this? And at the same time, I don't see the channel on the Discord, so the main ports of call for information will be the Flat to VR Twitter account, posts all the major updates, and then the Discord. The Discord is not just for this, but all Flat to VR modding. Some really great Unity mods from all parts of the community, other VR modding tools, some standalone stuff. Now, it can be a bit confusing when you initially join the Discord, but you would have to turn on visibility for the certain channels, and you want to find UE join for the Unreal Engine ones if you want to see, for example, the video channel where we post testing videos and the chat there. Okay, the next one I see a lot is, can I test so-and-so game? Maybe. If I own it or it's coming out, it looks cool, definitely drop a comment and I'll check it out. I've got quite a lot of stuff in the queue already, got about 40-50 things to test, but feel free to make your recommendations. It's always nice to see, and I can recommend it to some other people or check if anyone else has tested. But anything that is get tested or logged, I try and add it to my spreadsheet as well. Okay, so next one, just like what's next for the channel, what I'm working on. So yeah, I'm going to be working through the queue of games that haven't been tested with the Injector at all. Of course, it's slowed down a little bit because I do need to go back to old games with the newer builds to retest and retest new features. Some of the testing team, Praydog, coming up with some really cool new stuff that needs testing. And a lot of my tests are generally kind of first impressions of the game. Does it inject? Are all the basic things working? Gameplay, menu, UI, can I play it? For example, like I might not get to the very last level. There might be some horrible problem in the final boss, but I'm not sure. But these are generally just quick tests. Are the basic things working? And then I kind of go back and test some of newer builds, or if others suggest kind of quality of life improvements like mods or other more advanced settings to kind of get a better experience. Because a lot of these ratings that I would give quite subjective and generally the out of box impression, and something can improve quite a lot. So a game might be kind of works poorly, so it injects, but it's got all these problems, but after a few mods and tweaks it could be a works well. So yeah, that's what I'll be doing. Stay tuned here, and if I do anything cool, it's normally posted again by Flat to VR Twitter, so no need to follow me, but if you want to see all the the testing grind, that'll be here, and I'm always open for questions in the comments.